In 1667, the Dutch Republic gave away the island of Manhattan. They handed the future financial capital of the planet over to the British Empire, voluntarily. They walked away from a continent to secure a tiny piece of rock in the Banda Sea called Run. It is a volcanic speck. It barely measures 2 miles across. You could walk its length in an afternoon. Today, we treat this transaction as a historical punchline. The narrative suggests the Dutch were hopelessly short-sighted. We imagine naive merchants trading a global metropolis for a handful of spices. But corporate accounting operates on a different frequency than popular folklore. When the ink dried on the Treaty of Breda, the Dutch negotiators did not feel swindled. They celebrated an unmitigated geopolitical triumph. They had just dumped a bleeding asset to acquire the final piece of an airtight global monopoly. To understand the mathematics of this deal, you have to look at the ledgers of a Dutch colonial enterprise. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, evaluated the globe through the cold lens of dividend yields. From their boardrooms in Amsterdam, the North American outpost of New Netherland was a logistical headache. Manhattan in the 1660s was a muddy frontier settlement. It functioned primarily as a trading post for beaver pelts. The settlement was surrounded by hostile indigenous populations and heavily armed European rivals. Defending it required constant capital injection. The wooden palisade, built to protect the town, required endless repairs. Soldiers demanded wages. Warships had to cross the Atlantic just to maintain basic supply lines. The military expenditure consistently devoured the modest profits generated by the fur trade. In the eyes of the company accountants, Manhattan was a toxic asset. It was a line item soaked in red ink. The logistics of moving bulky animal skins across the ocean simply did not generate the profit margins necessary to justify the administrative overhead. Every winter brought the threat of starvation. Every skirmish threatened to drain the treasury further. Maintaining a foothold in North America was an open-ended financial liability. The British recognized this vulnerability perfectly. In 1664, English warships sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam. They seized the settlement without firing a single shot. The Dutch governor surrendered because a military defense was financially and physically impossible. The British immediately renamed the territory New York. This aggressive territorial grab ignited the Second Anglo-Dutch War. It was a brutal naval conflict fought over shipping lanes and global trade dominance. By the time diplomats gathered in the Dutch city of Breda in 1667 to negotiate peace, the reality on the ground was already locked in. The treaty simply formalized the facts on the map. The diplomats executed a pragmatic merger and acquisition agreement. The British kept the muddy fur post in North America. The Dutch formalized their hold on the Spice Islands in the east. To sweeten the exit from Manhattan, the English even ceded the sugar plantations of Suriname to the Dutch. Historical analyses from the Spice Islands blog highlight how perfectly this aligned with the VOC's strategic vision. They erased a massive defense expenditure from their books. They secured an environment they could actually control. The true prize of the treaty was the island of Room. According to records analyzed by Edible Manhattan, nutmeg was not merely a culinary addition in the 17th century, it was a biomedical obsession. Europeans firmly believed that the aroma of nutmeg could ward off the bubonic plague. It served as the ultimate marker of aristocratic status. A wealthy merchant would carry a silver grater in his pocket to shave the hard seed into his wine. A small pouch of this spice, sold in the markets of London, could equal several months of wages for a skilled craftsman. It carried the economic weight of modern crude oil.
The Myristica fragrans tree grew entirely on the Banda Islands. The VOC already controlled the major land masses in that specific archipelago. Run was the glaring loophole. As long as the British maintained a presence on that remote reef, they possessed the ability to smuggle seeds. They could bypass Amsterdam and undercut the retail price in Europe. A leaky monopoly drives down profit margins across the board. The Dutch approach to commerce required total isolation. They needed absolute, unchallenged power over every single nutmeg seed before it left the volcanic soil. Looking at the raw trade volumes from the era, I find it impossible to view the Dutch diplomats as victims of a bad trade. They secured exactly what their economic model demanded. The VOC corporate machine relied on engineered scarcity. If independent merchants managed to source spices outside the company network, the entire financial architecture of the Republic was at risk. Acquiring Run meant sealing the vault. The English flag was lowered over the reef, and the VOC finally stood entirely alone in the Banda Sea. We judge this historical moment through the lens of modern real estate. We look at the concrete canyons of Wall Street and the immense capital flowing through New York today. The merchants of 1667 operated under a completely different paradigm. Their wealth was built on physical exclusion. The ultimate goal of a colonial empire was to find a singular, finite resource and build an impenetrable wall around it. You own the source. You eliminate the competitors. You watch the treasury fill with gold. In that specific geopolitical moment, giving up an open, vulnerable trading post for an airtight monopoly was the smartest financial decision a mercantile empire could make. The Dutch secured their closed system. The corporate ledgers balanced perfectly. They possessed the rarest physical object in the world. To grasp the staggering return on investment this monopoly generated, we have to examine the VOC ledgers. The markup on nutmeg was not calculated in mere percentages. It was measured in magnitudes. A 10-pound sack of nutmeg purchased from local Bandanese chieftains cost the company less than a single English penny in trade goods. By the time that sack was offloaded in Amsterdam, its wholesale value had surged by an astonishing 32,000%. It was a margin that makes modern pharmaceutical pricing look restrained. Every returning ship carried enough liquid value to fund a small war. By officially excising the British from Run, the Dutch plugged the only leak in a pipeline of pure equity. The decades following the Treaty of Breda saw the VOC shower shareholders with annual dividends regularly exceeding 18%, a staggering figure for a pre-industrial corporation. But maintaining this flawless balance sheet required corporate ruthlessness bordering on the sociopathic. The VOC did not just guard their monopoly, they violently audited the supply chain through a policy of extirpation. To prevent any oversupply that might soften European prices, overseers calculated the exact global demand for nutmeg. If the harvest exceeded that projection, heavily armed fleets, the notorious Hongi Tokton, were dispatched to systematically chop down excess Myristica fragrans trees. They burned mountains of surplus nutmeg on the beaches of the Banda archipelago. On documented occasions, they deliberately set fire to their own warehouses in Amsterdam, burning perfectly good inventory to trigger a market panic and drive the spot price higher. This was not the behavior of foolish traders. This was the cold market manipulation of a cartel enforcing artificial scarcity.
Run was the linchpin of this brutal arithmetic. Without it, the British would have scooped up the excess harvest and shattered the price ceiling. If anyone still doubts the deliberate nature of this strategy, history offers a definitive secondary audit. 6 years after the Treaty of Breda, the geopolitical chessboard flipped. During the Third Anglo-Dutch War in 1673, a Dutch naval squadron sailed back into the harbour of New York. The English garrison, outgunned and chronically underfunded, surrendered without resistance. The Dutch flag was raised once more, and the city was stubbornly renamed New Orange. For 15 months, the supposed historical blunder of 1667 was completely reversed. The Dutch had Manhattan back in their asset portfolio. Yet, when diplomats convened to draft the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, the corporate directors in Amsterdam reviewed the financial projections again. They looked at the endless palisade repairs, the hostile frontier, the staggering logistical overhead of the fur trade, and the pathetic tax revenues. Then they looked at the massive, reliable profits flowing from the Banda Islands and the sugar plantations of Suriname. Their conclusion was unwavering. They voluntarily handed Manhattan back to the British for a second time. You cannot frame a transaction as a naive accident when the same executives are given a full refund, hold the asset for over a year, and then deliberately return it to the seller. The inclusion of Suriname further highlights the sophistication of Dutch portfolio management. Beaver fur was a volatile commodity tied to the fickle hat fashions of the Parisian elite. Sugar, however, was a dense, highly addictive calorie source, rapidly shifting to a mass-market staple. The Dutch swapped a logistical nightmare for intensely concentrated nodes of extreme profit. Sugar from Suriname and nutmeg from Run shared the exact same economic profile: localized production zones, high-density shipping metrics, and inelastic European demand. The Dutch essentially liquidated their underperforming venture capital branch to double down on high-yield, blue-chip commodities. To make a commodity truly priceless, discovering its sole geographic origin is merely the preliminary phase. You must be prepared to incinerate half of your own harvest on the cobblestone squares of Amsterdam. You must systematically slaughter anyone attempting to sell the product a fraction cheaper. The Dutch did not simply stumble into wealth during the 17th century. They engineered a vacuum. The instrument of this engineering was the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or the VOC. Historians frequently classify these entities as company states, though that term barely captures the sheer scale of the operation. The VOC was the world's first publicly traded mega-corporation featuring permanent share capital. It was not a temporary syndicate that dissolved after a single voyage. The Dutch government delegated sovereign rights directly to the board of directors, a group known as the Gentlemen's 17. They possessed the authority to wage war. They minted their own coinage. They established courts and constructed coastal fortresses across the Indian Ocean. Furthermore, the VOC established the world's first active secondary market for corporate shares. Merchants actively traded paper equity based on the anticipated arrival of spice fleets, permanently decoupling capital from the physical ships. They operated as an autonomous military wing, funded entirely by shareholder dividends. The product financing this military machine, Myristica fragrans, was not viewed as a simple culinary additive. Across Europe, medical treatises prescribed nutmeg as a definitive cure for the bubonic plague. Physicians, operating under early medical theories, believed the intense warmth of the spice counteracted the cold dampness of disease. It functioned as a potent aphrodisiac and a primary ward against digestive illnesses. Carrying a silver nutmeg grater in a waistcoat pocket signaled immense social elevation. Because European demand was virtually infinite and the natural supply was geographically constrained to the tiny Banda archipelago, corporate profit margins reached astronomical levels. Economic analyses of the era demonstrate that the markup frequently eclipsed several hundred times over the Asian purchase price.
Looking at the archival correspondence between the colonial administrators and the VOC board, the cold rationality of their accounting is striking. The men running the company operated under a singular financial directive. They had to retain the monopoly regardless of the human cost on the periphery of the empire. Governor-General Jan Pieter Koen codified this approach into official company policy. Koen understood the fundamental risk of colonial commerce. Competing on an open market inevitably drives prices down. He firmly believed his fiduciary duty to the shareholders justified extreme violence, provided it eliminated competing producers. Before the VOC tightened its grip, the Banda Islands hosted a population of roughly 15,000 indigenous residents. These local merchants maintained independent networks. They traded their harvest with Portuguese captains, English navigators, and independent Asian buyers outside the Dutch monopoly framework. Cohen perceived this free trade as a direct breach of contract. In his dispatches to the Gentleman 17, he framed the violent suppression of the Banda Islands as a necessary penalty for contract violation. It was an essential step to secure the corporate supply chain. The intervention was brutally efficient. The company reduced the local population to barely over 1,000 survivors. The rest were executed or systematically deported. Cohen then reformatted the entire archipelago into a highly optimized plantation economy. He divided the volcanic soil into designated agricultural lots known as perken. These plots were handed to European overseers who managed the harvest using enslaved laborers shipped from other parts of Asia. The native population was erased and replaced by a more predictable, captive workforce. This violence naturally extended to European rivals attempting to breach the perimeter. The English East India Company desperately wanted a fraction of the spice margins. When English merchants established a small foothold near the trade routes, the VOC swiftly accused them of treason against Dutch authority. The subsequent interrogations involved severe torture, leading to forced confessions and executions. This event, recorded as the Amboina Massacre, sparked outrage in London, but it served a very specific market function for the VOC. It acted as a violent barrier to entry. The Dutch ensured the English understood the lethal cost of attempting to access the spice flow. Controlling the soil was still insufficient to guarantee the artificial scarcity the board demanded. The company had to physically manage the biological output of the entire region. VOC administrators forced regional rulers across the Moluccas to physically chop down their own clove and nutmeg trees. If a tree grew on an island outside the direct jurisdiction of the VOC fortresses, it was considered a rogue asset and marked for immediate destruction. The corporate formula was mathematically rigorous. Less product sold at a premium always generated higher dividends than a larger volume sold at the market rate. This is precisely why the Treaty of Breda exchange made perfect sense to the VOC accountants. The English possessed a historical claim to Run, a microscopic island
in the Banda archipelago. It was geographically insignificant, but it represented a potential leak in the corporate pipeline. As long as the English could harvest even a single sack of nutmeg from Run, they could undercut the Amsterdam auctions. Trading Manhattan away was the cost of plugging that leak. The Dutch gladly handed over a sprawling North American territory just to remove the English flag from the Banda Sea forever. This obsessive control extended all the way back to the European docks. The VOC maintained strict quotas on how much mace and nutmeg could hit the auction blocks. They tightly limited the number of licensed brokers operating in Amsterdam. The company even utilized differential pricing, selling spices at vastly different rates in different European cities to heighten the perception of exclusivity and deficit. According to accounts detailed by historians like Stephen Bown, when warehouse stocks swelled to a level that threatened the artificially inflated prices, the company took drastic measures. They simply set the surplus on fire. The heavy scent of burning spices drifted through the Dutch capital. Through these mechanisms, nutmeg ceased to be a plant. It transitioned into an early financial derivative. It became a tightly controlled instrument designed to transfer wealth from European aristocrats directly into the VOC treasury. Every variable in the chain was accounted for. The volcanic soil was secured. The independent native traders were eliminated. The European rivals were terrified into submission or bought off with North American real estate. The architecture of artificial scarcity was theoretically flawless. The Dutch had built a planetary-scale fortress around a single genus of tree. The entire financial model required absolute isolation to function. By the end of the 1660s, the corporate directors in Amsterdam were entirely confident they had achieved total hermetic containment. That absolute confidence rested on a fatal misunderstanding of biology. The corporate directors in Amsterdam could audit every ledger. They could inspect the hold of every returning galleon. They could not audit the sky. The primary saboteur of the Dutch East India Company did not sail under a rival flag. It was the pied Imperial Pigeon. Ducula bicolor. These large nomadic birds flew freely across the Banda archipelago. They possessed a highly specialized digestive system. A pigeon would swallow the nutmeg fruit whole. Its stomach acids stripped away the fleshy pericarp and the crimson mace. The hard inner seed remained entirely intact. The bird would then fly to a neighboring uncontrolled island. It digested the meal. It excreted a perfectly viable, pre-fertilized seed into the volcanic soil. The VOC's security perimeter was rendered completely irrelevant. Nature simply flew over the wall. Accounts from European sailors describe a surreal scene. Heavily armed VOC guards routinely fired their muskets into the jungle canopy. They were trying to shoot down the local wildlife. Some reports even noted pigeons getting visibly drunk on fermenting nutmeg fruit, staggering on branches before being picked off by frustrated soldiers. But the Dutch were fighting a war of attrition against an ecosystem. Modern genetic analysis of Myristica fragrans confirms the futility of their effort. The DNA indicates that the seeds had been naturally drifting north via ocean currents and avian carriers long before the first European keel cut the water. Archaeological records show local indigenous populations utilizing the spice over 3.5 millennia ago. The Dutch response to this natural expansion was brutal. If they could not stop the birds, they would control the ground. They dispatched heavily armed patrols to scour neighboring islands, actively burning down any excess nutmeg trees they found to keep the global yield artificially low. They mandated that only lime-washed dead nuts could leave the secure zone. The human cost was absolute. In 1621, VOC officials initiated the systematic slaughter of the native Bandanese population. Those who survived the violence were enslaved. They were forced to work the very plantations their ancestors had tended for centuries. The company replaced a fluid, ancient trading network with a static prison camp.
It was a closed loop, or so it seemed. The true breach of the VOC's botanical fortress came from a French intendant named Pierre Poivre. He was an administrator, a botanist, and a man who had lost part of his right arm, including his fingers, to a cannonball off the coast of China. In a twist of linguistic fate, his surname literally translated to pepper. Poivre became the living embodiment of the botanical smuggler. To the VOC, his actions constituted blatant piracy. To the French state, he was a black operatives director, tracking the spread of these smuggled seeds through French colonial records. I find it fascinating that the VOC's greatest blind spot was the very nature of the product they sold. Poivre understood the geopolitical reality better than the accountants in Amsterdam. He saw seeds not as agricultural products, but as strategic military assets. They were equivalent to warships. He reviewed the Dutch monopoly and found it highly vulnerable. He noted in his correspondence that the Spice Islands were the Garden of Europe. He wrote flatly that God had scattered plants across the world, and they were not meant for the exclusive profit of a single nation. His strategy was direct biological sabotage. Poivre treated the theft of Myristica fragrans as high-stakes espionage. He funded covert expeditions. His agents slipped past the naval blockades and approached the enslaved locals. They offered raw silver and imported textiles. In exchange, they asked for just a few handfuls of unsterilized, viable seeds. They executed a botanical heist right at the base of the VOC's watchtowers. The smuggling techniques were desperate and inventive. British and French operatives hollowed out the heels of their boots. They tucked raw seeds deep into the elaborate feather plumes of their tricorn hats. They sewed the precious cargo directly into the linings of their heavy woolen coats. There is a persistent rumor from the era regarding one of Poivre's agents. He supposedly transported live nutmeg saplings by disguising them as exotic decorative foliage. The cargo was ostensibly a frivolous gift for a colonial governor's wife. The VOC guards at the checkpoint inspected the shipment. They dismissed it as a lady's whim. The saplings went through. The stolen genetic code crossed the Indian Ocean. Poivre established the Jardin des Pamplemousses on Île-de-France, the island known today as Mauritius. He did not just plant a garden, he built a classified agricultural laboratory. He deposited the contraband nutmeg into the soil. The climate was favorable, the plants took root. The biological blockade was officially broken. This is the supreme irony of the 1667 Treaty of Breda. The Dutch traded away Manhattan to secure the island of Roon. They believed that by acquiring that final piece of volcanic rock, they had sealed the vault forever. They traded a dynamic, open-ended geographic asset for absolute control over a closed biological system. But a living plant cannot be locked away. While the VOC spent a fortune policing the waters of Banda, the code was already replicating thousands of miles away on a French island. The seeds were out. The biological vault was permanently breached. However, the ultimate ruin of the Dutch East India Company
did not come from a rogue French botanical garden on Mauritius. It came directly from their own ledger books. The architecture of artificial scarcity is inherently fragile. It is also the most expensive structure a civilization can build. To maintain an absolute grip on the Banda Islands, the VOC constructed a planetary fortress. A closed system demands an infinite supply of capital to remain closed. By the dawn of the 18th century, the corporate headquarters in Amsterdam was operating less like a nimble trading firm and more like a paranoid military dictatorship. Every single clove and every harvested nutmeg seed required a bayonet to protect it. The physical footprint of this paranoia was staggering. The company fortified dozens of remote islands across the archipelago. They hauled heavy siege materials halfway across the globe to build European-style castles in the deep tropics. They maintained a massive standing army of mercenaries. The raw logistics of maintaining a military force 6 months away by sail required massive, continuous shipments of silver coin. This was a brutal, inefficient operation. The colonial capital of Batavia was a malaria-ridden swamp. The mortality rate among VOC soldiers was terrifying. Replacing a dead guard meant recruiting another impoverished soul from the slums of Europe. The company paid for his passage, fed him for half a year at sea, only for him to succumb to tropical fever within months of arriving in the East Indies. The spice monopoly was quietly subsidized by a continuous influx of European corpses. The cost of replacing them drained the corporate treasury faster than the spice could fill it. The fixed costs of military enforcement rapidly eclipsed the revenue generated by the commodity. The VOC mutated, it bloated. To compensate for the staggering overhead, the colonial administrators squeezed the market even harder. They actively destroyed their own supply. Burning mountains of perfectly good nutmeg in public squares back in Europe went beyond aggressive economics. It was an act of profound desperation. The directors set fire to their own capital to create an illusion of scarcity. The corporate rot spread inward. The legendary directors back in the Netherlands paid their colonial staff notoriously low wages. The inevitable mathematical result was rampant internal smuggling. The very officials tasked with guarding the monopoly were quietly skimming the inventory to survive. The thick stone walls of the fortress meant nothing when the guards routinely left the side doors unlatched for a cut of the profits. To keep the illusion of immense profitability alive for their shareholders, the VOC began taking on massive debt. They borrowed money simply to pay for the mercenaries who protected the spice that was supposed to make them rich. It became a corporate Ponzi scheme built entirely on the aroma of a single seed. By 1799, the greatest megacorporation in human history was functionally insolvent. It collapsed under the crushing weight of its own security apparatus. The company was nationalized, the monopoly shattered into pieces. I find the root of this long obsession hidden inside the very biology of the plant. Nutmeg and mace come from the exact same fruit. You harvest the inner kernel for one spice and peel away the crimson web-like aril for the other. This dual yield made the trade botanically complex and fiercely lucrative. To control the tree was to hold a monopoly on two of the most valuable substances on Earth simultaneously. Remember why the map of the modern world was drawn in the first place. Columbus was hunting for spices. The discovery of a new continent was merely an accidental byproduct. He stood on the shores of Cuba, listening to locals talk about gold, and his mind immediately translated it into rumors of cinnamon and nutmeg. For 2 centuries, the entire European imagination was hijacked by the scent of the Moluccas. The Treaty of Breda was supposed to be the triumphant final chapter of that obsession. Meanwhile, the British were running a completely different experiment on the other side of the Atlantic. When they officially secured the muddy, unruly settlement of New Amsterdam through that exact same treaty in 1667, they did not lock it down. The Dutch had viewed Manhattan merely as a strategic fur-trading outpost, a logistical headache constantly draining resources to fight off Native American raids. The British took this bleeding asset, rebranded it New York, and threw the harbor gates wide open. The settlement at the tip of the Hudson River was a chaotic, unpolished junction. The British realized they did not need to monopolize a rare biological crop to generate unprecedented wealth. They monopolized the infrastructure of exchange itself. Manhattan sits at a natural geographic funnel for an entire continent's interior. The island quickly became a massive clearinghouse for risk. It attracted a continuous stream of aggressive speculators and rogue merchants. The economy of early New York was porous. This porosity was its ultimate strength. Ships brought bulk cargo and manufactured goods from Europe. Most importantly, they brought a constant stream of people. Manhattan functioned as a blank slate. The island possessed 0 high-margin commodities of its own. The soil itself held no value. The true wealth generated entirely from the sheer volume and velocity of transactions passing through its docks. In the emerging geography of global capitalism, a node is infinitely scalable. A nutmeg tree yields a rigidly fixed number of seeds per year. A deep-water port with free-flowing capital has no theoretical limit. An open system thrives on friction and collision. It generates new industries spontaneously. When the regional beaver fur trade inevitably dried up, Manhattan simply pivoted to oceanic shipping. When shipping logistics evolved, the island pivoted to manufacturing. Later, it would pivot seamlessly into global finance. The port became a permanent shapeshifter. It fundamentally did not matter what was being traded, as long as the trade happened right there. The Dutch tried to freeze time around a single tree. Manhattan adapted to the acceleration of time. The British stumbled into the operating system of the modern world. They acquired a platform. To grasp the sheer scale of this historical pivot, imagine looking at a satellite map right now. Fly back to the Banda Sea. Locate the island of Run. It remains a tiny speck of volcanic rock. The physical reality of the place today is a harsh, jarring mirror to its violent past. The grand colonial ambitions are gone. The island is largely forgotten by the global economy. It often lacks reliable, round-the-clock electricity. The beaches, once violently patrolled by heavily armed galleons, are frequently littered with plastic debris carried in by the ocean currents. The nutmeg trees are still there. The locals still harvest the seeds from the damp forest floor. The air still smells faintly of the warm, intoxicating spice that once drove empires to murder and funded private armies. But the origin of the spice no longer matters. You can buy a jar of ground nutmeg in any supermarket on Earth for pennies. The ultimate closed system collapsed into a culinary footnote. Then look at the asset the Dutch gladly surrendered. The skyline of New York is a towering monument to the triumph of the open network. The island is completely paved over. It produces nothing biological. It grows 0 crops. Yet, it is the undisputed beating heart of the global economy. Wall Street processes trillions of dollars in abstract value every single day. The history of that specific street is the perfect metaphor for the entire exchange. The Dutch had originally built a wooden wall across Lower Manhattan to keep outsiders away and protect their fragile settlement. The British took over, eventually tore down the defensive barrier and paved over the dirt path. They called it Wall Street. The very site of a failed territorial blockade became the central, hyper-connected artery of global capital. The dirt path transformed into the supreme router for human ambition.
Calling the Dutch diplomats foolish misses the entire context of 1667. By the strict accounting standards of their era, their logic was flawless. Manhattan was a toxic asset, bleeding red ink. Run was the undisputed crown jewel of the East. The Dutch won the negotiation. They secured their impenetrable vault. They simply failed to realize that the fundamental nature of wealth was changing while they held the key. The era of the single commodity empire was ending. The true engine of modern power operates far outside any walled garden. It relies entirely on the uncontrollable velocity of the network.